This is Robert Howe speaking, and I'm going to tell you a true story about a girl and a boy, Marie Young and Robert Howe, born in San Antonio, Texas, in 1923. We were born about 3 blocks apart and attended the same church and school. It was not until October 1938, on my way home from school, that a miracle happened. I was riding my bicycle and stopped to talk to a friend of mine who was walking with Marie. I asked if I could walk home with them. Marie turned at the next corner and asked me to walk home with her. I didn't know where she lived, and I didn't ask. I was hoping it was miles, as she was the prettiest girl I ever saw. How could I have missed her, and we only lived 3 blocks apart? We were both 14 and went together through high school. We graduated from high school in May 1941. I gave Marie an engagement ring our senior year in high school, and we talked about getting married. I always told her I would build her a white 2-story house like the one in our neighborhood. I had a job at the Pearl Brewery the summer of 1941, and Marie went to work at Fort Sam Houston. My job only lasted through the summer, and after that I worked as an elevator operator. In those days, elevators were not automatic. Whatever plans we had made came to a halt the morning of 7 December 1941. We were all in shock at the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and everyone talked about what they were going to do. Bill Burt, Marie's sister Margie's boyfriend, Russell Evans, and I talked about joining the Navy. We didn't know much about Japan. We talked about what a small country it was, and were sure the war wouldn't last long. We decided that we were going to get into the fight, we had better hurry. So Monday, 8 December 1941, Bill, Russell, and I was at the Navy recruiting office when it opened. Russell was colorblind, so they wouldn't take him. Bill and I was accepted, but had to go to Houston for a physical. They sent us home and said they would call us. It seemed to me like everyone wanted in the Navy. It was Christmas, and we still hadn't been called. Marie didn't want me to go, and we discussed marriage. But things were so unsettled that we decided to wait. In January 1942, I was finally called to go to Houston and was sworn into the Navy on 14 January 1942. We went to San Diego to boot camp, and the train stopped in San Antonio on the way to California. Marie's mother and dad, her sister, my mother and dad, and my sisters and brothers were all at the train to see us off. It was a sad day. I felt like I was making a bad mistake in leaving. I sure wanted to take Marie with me. We arrived in San Diego in boot camp with everything but what I expected. I looked at myself as some hero going off to fight for his country and found myself being treated like a prisoner. I guess part of it was that the Navy had more recruits than they could handle. We were clothed, given shots, and a rifle that wouldn't shoot, and weighed a ton after I carried it all day. Boot camp only lasted 3 weeks, and I was selected to go to San Francisco to school. Bill Burke was assigned to the USS Idaho. I was stationed on Treasure Island, which was between San Francisco and Oakland. Dad had taken us to the World's Fair that was on Treasure Island in 1939, and here I was now living in one of the old exhibit buildings. When we had time off, we would visit San Francisco and ride a streetcar to Ocean Beach. My mother, grandmother, and my 3 sisters came to San Francisco to visit me. It sure was good to see them, and we had a wonderful visit. Marie and Dad could not come as they both were working. I missed Marie more each day and would call her every week and ask her to come to California so we could get married. One Saturday night, I was at a USO dance, and all the sailors and girls were dancing and having a good time. It reminded me of all the good times Marie and I had dancing together. I decided to call her right then and ask her to come to California so we could get married. I never dreamed that she would say yes. I guess you could call it the second miracle of the many that God had given us in our life together. The first thing I said to her was, "Will you come to California so we can be married?" She said yes. I have sold your car and will be there about the 6th of May, 1942. I was so surprised and happy I don't remember what I said. Marie arrived in San Francisco on 7 May 1942. We were married on 9 May 1942 in the San Francisco courthouse. After we paid $25 for our apartment for blood test and marriage license, we had $5 left. When I asked the judge what he would charge to marry us, he said, "Whatever you want to give me." I told him I had $5 and I would give him half. I think he thought I was joking. I had to ask him for my $2.50. It was about 1 p.m., so I took my new bride out to eat. Marie had a hamburger and I drank a Coke. Most of the $2.50 was gone. We went to a free dance in Oakland. Glenn Miller's orchestra was playing and we loved to dance to his music. We had a good time on very little money. Marie went to work the next week for $100 a month and I made $15. Our apartment was very close to the Golden Gate Park and not far from Golden Gate Bridge. We could ride a streetcar for a nickel and we would go to Ocean Beach. One weekend, a friend of mine, James Brooks, borrowed a Model A and we went to the Russian River. It was north of San Francisco across the Golden Gate Bridge. Brooks and I went wading and put our shoes on the back of the car. I drove back barefooted, and when I remembered our shoes, it was too late. We went back, but we couldn't find them. We left Marie at the guard gate as she couldn't go on the base. We got our new shoes and started back to the apartment. San Francisco was very hilly, and we had to go over some steep hills to get to our apartment. We started up one hill and stalled before we got to the top. I backed down and made a run at the hill again. It was Sunday afternoon, and a lot of people were sitting on the porch watching. This time they were rooting for us. We didn't make it. Back down and try again. This time people came to our aid and pushed us over the hill. They all laughed and we waved and thanked them as we went over the hill. I would ride the streetcar to work each day, and after school was over, I worked in the mess hall awaiting Simon. I was going to work about 5 a.m. and Marie would still be asleep when I left. One morning in early June, I arrived at the mess hall and was told to go to the barracks, that we had been assigned to a ship. We were told to pack our bags, that we would leave within the hour. I asked if I could call my wife, and they said no. I hoped somehow I would get to the phone, but it didn't happen. We were sent to the USS Helena at Mare Island Shipyard, about 50 miles from San Francisco. When I reached the ship, I started looking for a telephone to call Marie. No telephone aboard ship. Marie was only 18 and had never been away from home before. I knew she would be worried when I didn't come home. The next morning, I started again trying to find a way to call Marie. I talked to everyone that would listen and even put in for a special leave. By the third day, I was desperate, and when one sailor told me I could get off the ship with my ID card, which I still had, I didn't wait any longer. I put on my dress blues and left the ship. I never give going AWOL much of a thought, as my only thought was on Marie. I arrived at the apartment about noon the third day, and it was empty. I found a note saying, "I am leaving on the 1 o'clock train today. Love you, Marie." I wasn't sure when today was, since I had been gone for 3 days. I ran to the corner drugstore, and they said she had called a taxi that morning. I called a cab, but the streetcar came first, so I took it. I went to the depot in San Francisco, and she wasn't there. Then I went to the ferry that went to Oakland. She was getting ready to get on the ferry when I arrived. Another miracle. Another 5 minutes, and I would have missed her. We spent 24 hours together, and I put her on the train the next day. It was a sad parting, but we were both thankful that we got to see each other before I went overseas. I went back to the ship knowing I would be in trouble. The first thing my friend told me was that they had been looking for me all day. I knew now for sure I was in trouble, but it turned out they were looking for me to give me my leave. I didn't tell them I had been gone, only said that I changed my mind and canceled my leave. It was a brand new life aboard ship. There was about 50 of us from welding school. As best I could tell, they needed everything but welders. They called us together one day and asked where we would like to be assigned aboard ship. I knew very little about ship duties, so I asked to be assigned to anti-aircraft guns, which was the 5th Division. The Helena was torpedoed at Pearl Harbor and was in Mare Island for repairs. The USS Helena was built for a crew of about 700, but with the new anti-aircraft guns and radar, we had a crew of nearly 1,000. Since there was not enough bunks for everyone, I was assigned 2 hooks in the mess hall for my hammock. Sleeping in the hammock was not too bad, but we had to put it up every night and take it down at 5:30 a.m. each day. We laced it up and stored it with our sea bag. I only had a small locker, and all my clothes were in my sea bag. The repairs to the ship was about complete, and we spent most of our time painting, loading stores, and ammunition. I still remember loading 6-inch ammunition from boxcars. Each projectile weighed 105 pounds, and I weighed 128. After that day, even the hammock felt good. We left Mare Island on 21 July 1942 and went to San Francisco. We left there 2 days later, escorting 6 supply ships. I will never forget going under the Golden Gate Bridge. I remember when Marie and I had drove over it in the Model A. My thoughts were on Marie and the ones I was leaving behind. Would I ever see Marie again? I always believed I would, but I had no idea what lay ahead. I looked at her pictures often and thought how much I loved her and wished we could be together. My thoughts soon changed as it started to get cold and rough, and I started to get seasick. My gun was a 20mm right below the bridge. The ammunition room was small, but we all crowded in it to get out of the cold. I didn't stay in there very long, as it was no place for someone who was already feeling sick. I needed all the fresh air I could get. After a couple of days, I got over it and was never bothered again. We had 4 men on our gun. A.J. Cole was the gunner. I was the assistant gunner. Wallace Gregory was the loader, and Douglas Denny manned the ammunition room. Cole was the only real sailor. He was on the Oklahoma at Pearl Harbor. The rest of us had joined the Navy after the war started. We passed Hawaii, they said. All I could see was some islands on the horizon. The transports only traveled at about 12 knots, so it was a slow trip. We finally reached Samoa, where we left the transports. We were close enough to see the sandy beaches, grass huts, and coconut trees, but did not stay long enough to get off the ship. Our mission now was to join the fleet in the South Pacific. We were traveling alone now, seeing nothing but ocean. We crossed the equator on 1 August 1942. Crossing the equator in the Navy is an important event. All sailors that have crossed the equator were called shellbacks. Everyone else was a pollywog. Days before we reached the equators, polywogs were assigned to watch for King Neptune. On the day we crossed the equator, King Neptune held court. Each pollywog had to be judged by King Neptune for any wrongs that he may have committed against a shellback. Before you entered King Neptune's court, you were escorted through a belt line. They used everything but belts. Boards and socks filled with sands were the things I remembered most. I was told not to run, but I didn't think my feet ever hit the deck. Next was a royal baby. He was a cute 300-pound baby in a diaper sitting next to King Neptune. We were told we must kiss the royal baby on the belly, but not to touch him, as he was very delicate. Each time you would bend over to kiss him, they would shock you. It was all I could do to keep from jumping in the middle of him. If you touched him, you went back through the belt line. I finally kissed the royal baby without touching him and was sent to stand before King Neptune. King Neptune had no charges against me, so I was sent to the royal barber. The royal barber chair was on the edge of a pool about 3 foot deep. After cutting your hair in whatever style the barber liked and applying the hairdo, which was several colors of paint, you were dumped over backwards into the pool. When you came up, you were supposed to yell you were a shellback. The only problem was that each time you came up and opened your mouth, two big sailors pushed you under again. The tank was full of hair and trying to get your breath, and the hair out of your mouth was all you could do to stay alive, let alone say you were a shellback. I think they finally decided I was dead, so they let me up and I yelled I was a shellback. I have never been back across the equator, but I still have my shellback card. Everything was quiet after that for a few days. We crossed the international date line on 5 August 1942. We hadn't seen anything but water for about 3 days. I spent most of my time now on the gun. The weather was warm and I started sleeping on the deck inside of our gun shield. I had all the hammock I could take and never liked it below deck. We had rubber tire mats on the deck, a life jacket for a pillow, and a blanket to cover with when it rained. It rained almost every day, but the water was warm and it seldom lasted very long. We had 2 men on watch at all times, but most of us stayed on the gun day and night, except to eat or go to the bathroom. We started each day at general quarters a half hour before sunrise. The rest of the day was spent sweeping and mopping the deck, chipping paint, painting, and standing watch on the gun. I had gone below to eat lunch the day we sighted the fleet. I was eating when they sounded general quarters. Everyone ran for their battle stations. When I got to my gun, I could see the ships on the horizon. There must have been 20 ships, and the way we were acting, I thought they were Japanese. Then I thought if they were, we should be going the other way. I am sure the captain knew they were U.S., which they were. Maybe he wanted to show them what a great fighting ship we were. He must not have impressed anyone, as we only stayed with him for a few days. We left the fleet with orders to go to the New Hebrides Island. We went to a little seaport called Villa La Villa. I got to go ashore one afternoon. It was the first time I had been off the ship in over a month. It was a small French town with one street and a few stores. We looked for something to buy as a souvenir, but all they had was the bare necessities of life, not much of that. I don't remember how it happened, but we started trading U.S. coin for French coin. The value didn't seem to matter to them, and it didn't to us. If they liked the looks of our coins and we liked theirs, we traded. We laughed and traded. They spoke French, I think, and I spoke Texan. I wound up with about 10 French coins, one very old, the size of a silver dollar, with a picture of Louis Napoleon Bonaparte on it. It's still in my locker aboard ship. We left the next day and escorted the Long Island to Guadalcanal. This small aircraft carrier carried 30 airplanes on its flight decks. The planes were loaded on the ship and had to be catapulted off the deck. They were going to Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. We made 2 trips and then returned to the fleet. We hadn't seen any action, but we knew it was all around us. There was a big sea battle near Guadalcanal on the 7th of August, 1942, and we lost 3 American cruisers, the Astoria, Quincy, and Vincent. We continued to patrol near Guadalcanal looking for the Japanese fleet, which was expected to attack Guadalcanal at any time. It was 15 September 1942, about noon, when we ran into a pack of Japanese submarines. We sounded general quarters, but this time I was on my guns. Ships started going in every direction. Everyone was watching for torpedoes. We didn't have any protection against submarines and could only watch for torpedoes and try to get out of the way. The destroyers were dropping depth charges everywhere. They each had 2 rows of depth charges on their stern and several Y guns. They were rolling depth charges off the stern, and the Y guns would shoot 2 in the air off each side of the ship. They had the water boiling. They kept the submarines off of most of us, but one submarine managed to attack the carrier Wasp. It was a sad sight. First one torpedo, then another, and another. It looked like she took 3 or more midship. You could see the fires, the ship starting to lean over, airplanes sliding off the deck, men running and some jumping over the side. We all wanted to fight back. The destroyers may have sunk a submarine or two, we never knew. All we could do was sit and watch. It was a long afternoon. The Wasp continued to burn, more explosions, and after about 3 hours they decided they couldn't save her. They took the rest of the men off and one of our destroyers sank her. We took about 500 survivors on the Helena, and each of us helped by giving them dry clothes and blankets. It was a sad day, but everyone was glad just to be alive. After this, the Navy changed the way we were operating. We formed cruiser, destroyer striking forces, and the carriers were to remain in port and go to sea only to give air cover. Our new base would be back to the New Hebrides, but on the other side of the island, from Villa La Villa, at a place called Espiritu Santos. I say a place because there was nothing there but a deep harbor and heavy jungle right down to the water. Head-hunting cannibals in the jungle, we were told. It became our home away from home. We would stay in port long enough to load supplies, ammunition, and fuel, and then back on patrol. We left Espiritu Santos with 3 other cruisers and 4 destroyers. It was early morning when we arrived at Guadalcanal. We had not gotten close enough to see the island when we escorted to Long Island. It was a big island, large green mountains with large coconut plantations along the beach. I didn't know it then, but we were about to remove the coconut trees. We were at general quarters when we were told the Japanese were holding that part of the beach and the Marines had requested we bombard the area. This was the first time we would fire our big 6-inch guns. We formed a line along the beach and all ships started firing. I don't know if we killed any Japanese, but we sure did knock down a lot of coconut trees. We left Guadalcanal that afternoon and started back to Espiritu Santos for more ammunition and to wait our next mission. Espiritu Santos was about 3 days' run from Guadalcanal. The Marines on Guadalcanal were holding on by a thread. They would lose Henderson Field 1 week and get it back the next. It was a real life and death tug of war. The Navy was not much better off. Since the Battle of Guadalcanal started, we had lost 2 carriers, the Wasp and the Hornet, 3 cruisers lost and 2 damaged and out of action. On our way back from Guadalcanal, the destroyer came alongside the Helena and we were all called to stand inspection. We had inspections often with Captain Reed, who had been in the Pentagon before the war and always wore his dress white uniform. This was kind of unusual, though, and then they announced that it was a change of command and Captain Hoover was taking over the Helena. He came aboard in a basket on a cable stretched between the destroyer and the Helena. When Captain Reed, dressed in his white, and Captain Hoover, dressed in slacks and short-sleeved shirt, inspected the crew, we knew things were going to be different aboard ship. Captain Hoover had been overseas since the war started. We didn't know it then, but he knew how to handle a fighting ship. We were in Espiritu Santos when we learned that the Japanese were sending ships to reinforce Guadalcanal. The Australians had coast watchers hidden on Japanese-held islands, and they would report Japanese ship movements to the Navy. We left Espiritu Santos with the San Francisco, Salt Lake City, Boise, and 3 destroyers. The Japanese ships were expected to arrive at Guadalcanal the night of 11 October or early a.m. on the 12th. Our plan was to be there waiting. Everyone was excited. We would get even for the sinking of the Wasp. It was well after dark when we neared Guadalcanal. We moved slowly in a single line as we approached the island. You could see the outline of the mountains as we got closer, the outline of the coconut trees. We were so close to the beach that I was sure we were going to run aground. The idea was to be so close to the island that the Japanese could not see us. A destroyer was in the lead, then the Boise, the Helena, the San Francisco, Salt Lake City, and the rest of the destroyers behind. We came almost to a stop and waited. Absolutely no lights or noise. The Japanese were on their way in, coming in from the north. The Japanese fleet was reported to consist of cruisers, destroyers, and transports. It was a black night, and looking out over the water, we could see nothing. My heart was pounding. There was an air duct from the radar shack that opened onto our gun, and we could hear them report to the bridge. It was about midnight when we heard the first report to the bridge. Ships at 12,000 yards, then 10,000 yards, 8,000 yards. We strained our eyes and could see nothing. Then it reported 6,000 yards, 4,000 yards. Open fire. Our 15 6-inch guns all went off at once. The night was on fire. One Japanese destroyer was on fire and others were hit. All of our ships were firing. The Japanese were not returning the fire as they were caught by surprise. We could see the Japanese running to their battle stations, and with minutes they were firing back. All ships were changing course and speed to avoid attack. Our ship used a green and white light to keep from shooting each other. Even then there was so much firing and Japanese ships sinking and burning it was difficult to know who was who. We were watching ships burn when we saw a destroyer blinking a red light heading straight for us. Captain Hoover held his fire, but one of our other ships opened fire and the destroyer was hit and started to sink. We found out later that it was one of our destroyers that had lost his mask that held the green and white lights, and he decided to use a red light. It was very sad but not surprising, as it was impossible to know where each ship was after about 5 minutes into the battle. The Admiral ordered Captain Hoover to turn on our searchlights so he could see what was left of the Japanese fleet. Captain Hoover reported that our searchlights were out of order. Truth was that Captain Hoover was using our new radar and he didn't think he needed the searchlights. I never knew if the Admiral ever found out the truth. The Admiral then ordered the Boise to turn on her searchlights, which she did. The Boise was still in front of us, and when she turned on the lights, it lit up the bay like it was daytime. The Japanese didn't have any problem in seeing the Boise, and within seconds she was hit and on fire. From that moment on, the war looked different to me. I thought to myself, that could have been us, and I could have been killed. What if Captain Hoover had turned on our searchlights? Never again was I anxious to go into battle. The Boise was hit hard and burning. She turned and put us between her and the Japanese. I knew we'd be hit any minute, as her fire made us an easy target. I held my breath, but it didn't happen. Our guns had finished the Japanese fleet. The Navy reported 4 Japanese cruisers, 4 destroyers, and 1 transport sunk. The Boise made it back to San Francisco, and the Salt Lake City went back to Pearl Harbor for repairs. The San Francisco Helena and 2 destroyers went back to Espiritu Santos for more supplies, ammunition, and fuel, and to wait for the next mission. After that night, Espiritu Santos didn't look so bad. I never liked loading ammunition, and when they called all hands working party, I would take my 20mm apart and clean and polish it till the work was over. This worked most of the time, and our gunner A.J. Cole would defend me. This would upset the bosun mate in charge of the working party, and he would always try to catch me before I could get my gun. It became a game with me. I won some and lost some. We never stayed in Espiritu Santos more than a week, and we were off again. This trip was to patrol near Guadalcanal, waiting for a report of Japanese ship sightings. We were with the San Francisco Chester and 4 destroyers. The Helena had 4 40mm mounts and 12 20mm mounts. Each one was equipped with a telephone to the bridge. We took turns manning the phone on the bridge. It was the 20th of October, and I had the 8 to 12 midnight watch on the bridge. I was talking to a Navy lieutenant from Dallas, Texas, when all hell broke loose. We ran into another pack of Japanese submarines. Torpedoes were coming from everywhere. We looked aft and saw the Chester hit and on fire. A torpedo blew up near our stern before it reached us. We were not hit, but it was close. We were watching for torpedoes when I saw one coming straight at us. As the lieutenant and I watched, he said, "Hold on, it's going to hit right below us." I held my breath. Nothing happened. We ran to the other side of the bridge and watched the torpedo going the other way. It was set too deep. It went right under us. I have no idea how many Japanese submarines there were, but there was at least 20 torpedoes sighted that night. The lieutenant and I counted 6. The Chester was the only ship hit. She went home for repairs, and we went back to Espiritu Santos. No ammunition to load this time, as we hadn't fired a shot. We did do something new on the way back. We refueled at sea. We pulled alongside a tanker, both moving at about 10 knots. Hoses were pulled from the tanker and hooked to our fuel tank. It was risky. If we had ran into submarines while refueling, it could have been disastrous. We did this often after this and was always lucky. Back at Espiritu Santos, we waited for the next mission. One day they decided to let us go swimming off the side of the ship. The water was clear and deep. They stationed Marines with rifles along the deck to shoot sharks if they should come around. I almost changed my mind, but dove off with a lot of other crazy sailors. The water was warm and so clear you could see the screws under the ship. We had a nice swim. No shark. The first part of November started going our way. On the 4th of November, we escorted a convoy of transports to Guadalcanal and covered for them while they landed troops. We stayed around all night, and the next morning we shelled the area of Guadalcanal that was held by the Japanese. It was back to Espiritu Santos for more ammunition, out again the next day. The Navy learned that the Japanese were planning a major attack on Guadalcanal. Large numbers of transports, cruisers, destroyers, and at least one battleship had been spotted north of Guadalcanal. We were back at Guadalcanal on the 12th of November, supporting new landings and shelling Japanese gun positions. It was about mid-morning when we got a report of a possible air attack. We manned our 20 millimeters and waited. Cole was strapped into the gun, and I was moving it into position. This would be the first time that we would shoot at a live target. We would be in the battle and not just a spectator. Then we saw them. They were coming in from over the mountains of Talagi Island. Talagi was on the opposite side of the bay from Guadalcanal. We counted 12 twin-engine torpedo planes. Our 5-inch guns started shooting first. They had a range of about 5 miles. We had to wait. Our guns only would shoot about a mile. They were soon in our range, and we opened fire. Cole was on target. I could see our tracers going into one plane. It passed by and crashed into the sea. We moved to another. The air was full of tracers, and the planes came in low in between some of our ships. We had to be careful not to shoot each other. One plane went down and crashed into the San Francisco. I never saw one plane drop a torpedo. 11 planes were down, and the one that got through was met by planes from Henderson Field. He crashed into the mountains. It was a total victory with very little damage to the San Francisco. We were leaving Guadalcanal and glad to be headed back for Espiritu Santos. Then the word came. The Japanese ships that were sighted north of Guadalcanal were headed south and were expected to be in Guadalcanal area around midnight, with a force of 20 ships or more. We turned and headed back. We had 3 cruisers and 4 destroyers. I thought to myself, are we going to take on 20 Japanese ships? This would be suicide. If they had have asked me, I would have voted for Espiritu Santos. There was really no choice but to steam at full speed back for Guadalcanal. We were joined by 2 more cruisers and 4 more destroyers. We now had 13 ships. The USS San Francisco with Admiral Callahan in charge of the task force, and the USS Portland. They were both heavy cruisers with 8-inch guns. The USS Helena was next with her 6-inch guns. The 2 other cruisers were the USS Atlanta and the USS Juno with 5-inch guns. Admiral Scott was aboard the Atlanta. The Atlanta and the Juno were not designed to fight sea battles. but to protect aircraft carriers from submarines and aircraft attack. They had just arrived at Guadalcanal and were on their way to join the carrier task force. Admiral Callahan knew he needed everything in the area if we had any chance of stopping the Japanese and saving Guadalcanal. The rest of our task force consisted of 8 destroyers. A sea battle outnumbered 2-1, and 16-inch guns against 8-inch guns was not taught in Annapolis. I didn't know it then, but they never expected any of us to make it through the battle, and only hoped we could do enough damage to slow the Japanese landing. The rest would be up to the Marines, who were dug in with little hope of holding off a landing of this size. It was a black night in more ways than one. We formed a single line, 4 destroyers in our lead, then the San Francisco, Portland, Helena, Atlanta, Juneau, and the other 4 destroyers in the rear. We were heading north and should arrive at Guadalcanal before midnight. The closer we got, the quieter it became. I think everyone sensed the danger, even though we still had no contact with the Japanese fleet. I was praying to God to watch over us and thinking of Maria and how much I loved her. It's hard to explain how you feel, looking out over the water into the dark of the night, knowing soon you would hear the report from the radar room. Contact, ships at some distance off. How many we still were not sure. We would look, but we wouldn't be able to see them. It was hard to keep from shaking. 2 of us were on constant lookout. The other 2 would man the gun. We knew we wouldn't shoot it in a sea battle, but we needed something to hold on to. Hours passed. We were getting close. We could see the outline of the islands. We were in a single line halfway between Guadalcanal and Tulagi heading north. The Japanese were heading south. Right before you enter the gulf between Guadalcanal and Tulagi, there was an island that looked like a large mountain called Savo Island. The Japanese divided their fleet at Savo Island, half going right and the other half going left. Let's put half of their ships close to Tulagi and the other half near Guadalcanal. Since we were going up the middle, this meant that we would go right between the 2 forces. This was not a planned attack, as neither the Japanese or the U.S. knew where the other was at this time. We knew we must be getting close. Then a report went to the bridge. Contact, enemy ships on the port and enemy ships on the starboard, 23 in all. We had all our guns turned on, the ones on the port side. This was the side of the ship my gun was on. We looked, but we couldn't see anything. Then it happened. A Japanese cruiser turned on his searchlights. I nearly jumped out of my skin. It looked like he was pointing it right at me. I could have read the newspaper, but Captain Hoover had other plans. While they were pointing lights, we were pointing guns. All 15 6-inch guns went off at once. We could fire 100 rounds of 6-inch ammunition a minute. The cruiser was hit and sinking. We watched it go under with the searchlight still burning. By now, everyone was shooting at someone, the Japanese shooting back. Admiral Callahan divided his fleet. The lead destroyers, Portland and the San Francisco, turned and attacked the ships on our port, and we continued on, leading the Atlanta, Juneau, and 4 destroyers against the ships on our starboard. This was the last thing that resembled anything of a formation. It appeared it was every man for himself after that. Captain Hoover would fire our aft guns, then the forward guns, then hold his fire. Full speed ahead, slow down. He was doing everything to keep the Japanese from getting a range on us. Japanese planes were dropping flares attached to parachutes that would float down and light up everything. Find a new target and start shooting again. The San Francisco was hit hard. When they made their turn, they were hit topside. Admiral Callahan and almost everyone on the bridge and deck was killed. A lieutenant was the only officer alive on the bridge. Over 300 dead. The Portland was hit by a torpedo and was unable to steer and was going around in circles. She finally got to Tulagi and hid. We continued to look for new targets. By night it was impossible to know where anyone was. There was 2 ships aft shooting at each other, 2 to port shooting it out. We didn't use any signal lights in this battle. Which one should we help? We couldn't shoot. We couldn't tell which one was ours. Then out of the dark came the Juno. For a moment I knew she was going to ram us. We only bumped aft as she went by. The Atlanta was hit and sinking. They ran her up on the beach, but she slid off and sank. Admiral Scott was killed. Captain Hoover was looking for the San Francisco when we spotted a large ship in front of us and started following it. As we got closer, I said to Cole, "That sure looks like a battleship." We got there just in time to see it hit the Juno. It was a terrible sight. Part of the ships were flying everywhere. I saw a complete 5-inch gun mount fall into the sea and sink. There was probably 10 or 20 men inside. They never had a chance. A 10-foot piece of the Juno landed on our deck aft. All we could see now was a large black cloud of smoke. We watched as it cleared and wondered how bad off the Juno would be, and what we might do to help her. The smoke cleared and there was nothing. It was gone. We were all in shock. We couldn't believe it. We looked for men in the water and saw nothing. 900 men on a Juno, and it appeared as if no one survived. Lookouts with field glasses searched the area and could see no one. One sailor on our port gun started shaking and had a chill. We put a blanket around him and he sat in the corner the rest of the day. The shock was almost too much for him, and I wasn't much better off. Captain Hoover ordered all ships to continue south at full speed. The destroyers had nothing left to fight the submarines, and everyone was short of fuel. Since we could see no survivors, Captain Hoover decided we should not hang around and risk losing another ship. We learned later that 10 men survived, 890 dead. Aboard was the 5 Sullivan brothers, all killed. We often talked about getting hit by a torpedo so we could go back to the States for repairs. Never again after seeing the Juno disappear under a cloud of smoke. After the day, I don't think anyone took their eyes off the water. It was a long afternoon, but we were running at 25 knots now, and in much less danger from submarine attack. 2 days later, we arrived at New Caledonia. This was our first time here. It was a large port with a small town of Noumea. The San Francisco docked first, as they had a large number of wounded that needed to be transferred to the Naval Hospital. We came alongside the San Francisco and tied up next to her. It was the first time I had a close look at the damage to the bridge. When I saw the gun placement, which would have been about the same place as mine, there wasn't enough room to stand sideways without getting killed. I got cold chills and started to shake. What if it would have been us that turned? God sure had been looking out for me. There was good news from Guadalcanal. The Japanese had regrouped the next day and sent 1 cruiser and 6 destroyers to bombard Guadalcanal. They were turned back by our PT boats. They wouldn't give up. They were determined to take Guadalcanal. The next night they came back again with 1 battleship, cruisers, destroyers, and transports. This time they were met by 2 U.S. battleships, the North Carolina and South Dakota, and several destroyers. The battleships had just arrived from the States. Most of the Japanese forces were destroyed and only a few ships escaped. We lost 2 destroyers. The 3-night battles for Guadalcanal was over. What started out to look like a complete disaster for the U.S. Navy and the Marines turned out to be the end of the Japanese threat to Guadalcanal. I still believe that if the Japanese would have attacked us in the daylight, we would have lost. The darkness and confusion was in our favor. There was no way to be sure of how many Japanese ships were lost, but the Navy reported Japanese losses for the 3 nights to be: sunk 1 battleship, 3 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 5 destroyers, 5 transports, and 4 cargo transports. Damaged 1 battleship, 6 destroyers, and the Navy estimated from 20 to 40,000 troops were lost aboard the sunken transports. We lost the Atlanta, Juno, and 6 destroyers. God was surely on our side. The next day, we were ashore in Nemea. It was a nice town with paved streets and a few cars. We walked down Main Street looking around. Not much to see or do, so we went back to the ship. We stayed there for about a week and left for Espiritu Santos. The San Francisco would be heading back to the States. It was a sad parting, as we had been fighting side by side for over 4 months. It was kind of like leaving a best friend. We were back at Espiritu Santos, and it was almost December. We hadn't received any mail in almost a month. When the mailboat pulled alongside, all you could see was sacks of mail. I was hoping 1 sack was for me. It seemed like forever before they started mail call. They sorted the mail by division, and each division had mail call. They would go through the mail 1 letter at a time and call out each name. I always got lots of mail, but it was sad to see sailors waiting for letters and never hearing from anyone. I think Marie wrote me almost every day. Mr. and Mrs. Young, Marie's mother and dad, my mother and dad, grandmother, and brothers and sisters wrote often. I never got too much mail. When mail call was over, I would take my stack of mail to my gun and sort it by date. I always read Marie's first. She always told me how much she loved me and missed me. It made me feel wonderful and able to keep going. I enjoyed all my letters very much, as everyone would tell me about what they had been doing and that everything was okay at home. In one of Marie's letters, she told me about Margie and Bill getting married. I was glad for them. Guadalcanal was secured now, and everything was quiet during December. We stayed at Espiritu Santos longer than usual. The Seabees had cleared off an area of the beach that had a swimming area and a baseball diamond. We got to go ashore for the first time on Espiritu Santos. We were allowed 2 beers. I hadn't had a beer in 6 months. There was a ball game going on, and I was more interested in playing ball than the 2 beers. It was the officers against the enlisted men. I wanted to play, but the only position that was open was catcher. I wasn't a catcher, but I wanted to play, so I said, okay, let's play ball. I was doing okay, and it was a close game. The officers had a man on third, and there was only 1 out. The ball was hit to third, but the man on third was trying to score. The play was at home plate. I saw him coming, and he looked like some big college fullback. I caught the ball and blocked home plate. He was out, but so was I. I don't know how I held on to the ball or how long I was out. All I know is they had to find a new catcher. I was so bruised up that I went back to the ship without drinking my beer. It was a few days later, and I had a chance to go ashore again. There was an Australian ship in port, and they invited us to a track meet. I thought this had to be easier than baseball. I had ran track in junior school and did a little high jumping. So I said, okay. When we got to the area where we were to meet the Australians, I looked around and didn't see anything that looked like a track. I found an Australian and asked him what events they were having. Only one, he said, a 3-mile cross country. Oh boy, this might be worse than baseball. I had been living in a 10-foot diameter gun shield for 6 months, and all we did was sit down or stand up. I wanted to back out, but they insisted we join them. I said, okay, I would give it a go. I never expected to finish, and I only hoped I didn't get lost in the jungle. We started out on a narrow trail that had been hacked out of the jungle. You had to jump over stumps, duck under vines, and turn about every 10 or 15 feet. I was dying, but I knew I was over halfway as they had marked the halfway point. Going back would be further than going ahead, so I kept running. I finally got to the finish line. I fell to the ground, my legs ached, I was throwing up, and I lay on the ground thinking. The Japanese didn't get me, but the Australians had. Some friendly Australian who hadn't ran came over and helped me up. He congratulated me and said I came in 10th and was the first American to finish. I thought to myself there must have been only 10 that ran. Then I saw others still coming in, so I did better than I ever dreamed. They took me to the winners area and presented me with a 6-pack of beer. I almost threw up. I was still too sick to look at a beer. I couldn't take it back to the ship, so I gave it to my friends. I hadn't had a beer in 6 months, and the way I was going, it might be another 6 months before I drank one. We left Espiritu Santos a few days later. We had only light cruisers now. The St. Louis, sister ship to the Helena, the Honolulu, and the Australian cruiser, and 4 destroyers. We passed by Guadalcanal and patrolled to the north. We stayed in the area for almost 2 weeks, but everything was quiet. The closest Japanese island was New Georgia, about 150 miles north of Guadalcanal. We spent Christmas at sea. It was a beautiful day, and everyone was talking about loved ones at home and looking at pictures. I miss Marie and all the family. We always had a big Christmas together and big meals together. My mother and Marie's mother both had big round oak dining tables. I remembered all the meals we had together and all the card games we played after dinner. I was homesick. It was Christmas, and all the ones I loved were 12,000 miles away. I sat down and wrote Marie a letter and told her how much I missed her and how much I loved her. That was the only Christmas present I could give her. It was a new year, and we had rang it in with any fireworks, thank God. We had patrolled now for almost a month and had not seen the Japanese since the Battle of Guadalcanal. Food was getting low, and each meal looked the same. A slice of roast, mashed potatoes and gravy, nothing like Mom made, no taste. I think the potatoes were powdered, and I know the eggs we had for breakfast were, as they turned green. I never got used to green scrambled eggs. I closed my eyes and ate them. The law was about to come to an end. The Marines and the Army had captured all the Japanese on Guadalcanal and were planning to invade New Georgia Island. We headed north on the 4th of January and shelled Japanese gun emplacements on New Georgia. That night, the Japanese didn't return our fire, and we encountered no Japanese ships. No one could forget the Battle of Guadalcanal, and we all knew out there in the dark somewhere there was Japanese ships. We were all glad to see the sun come up, and in a couple of hours we would be passing by Guadalcanal. We had been on watch all night and was back to a 4 on and 4 off. It was about 10 a.m. and Gregory and I was lying on the deck looking up the sky when I spotted 6 planes overhead. They were very high and hard to see. I showed them to Gregory and said, "Look, we have air cover." They always told us we had air cover and that the carriers were backing us up. We never believed them because each time we got back to Espiritu Santos, the carrier Enterprise was always there. Well, maybe this time they had told us the truth, so we just watched as they got closer. I guess no one but Gregory and I saw them, because when they got directly overhead, they dove straight down at us. We knew then they weren't ours. We jumped to our gun and reported to the bridge. They sounded general quarters, and soon the 5-inch guns were firing at them. They made one high-altitude bombing run and were gone. They never got close enough for us to shoot, and as far as I could tell, none of them were hit. I didn't think any of our ships were hit, but found out the Australian cruiser took one bomb. The ship was not damaged much, but I am sure some sailors were killed or wounded. I hoped it wasn't any of the sailors I had met when we ran cross country. I never found out as they went back to Australia for repairs, and I never saw them again. We headed back to Espiritu Santo. I knew there would be lots of working parties since we were low on supplies and needed more ammunition. I decided working was better than fighting, so I didn't even try to get out of this one. I wound up on the store's working party and carried cases of canned goods from a supply ship tied up next to it. I met a sailor on the supply ship that was a gunner, the same as I was. He told me how they unloaded, then went back to San Francisco. I told him that must be very dull. Then I told him about the battles we had been in and how exciting it was. God forgive me for lying, but I was hoping he might want to trade duties. I had all the fighting I wanted. We talked on, and then he said, would I like to trade? I said I would check it out and for him to see if he could get an okay. I didn't sleep much that night thinking about it. I saw him early the next day, and he had gotten the okay. I told him that I hadn't gotten to see my division officer yet, but would get right back with him. My division officer said okay, but the executive officer turned me down. I was very disappointed, but I had to put it behind and went back to loading supplies. Anyway, we would have better chow now, and they would be opening the guidon stand, the store, which had been closed for a month. There would always be a long line, and no one bought one of anything. You bought the whole carton. When you got to the window, you bought whatever kind of pogey bait candy they had. I was lucky this time. I got a box of chocolate bars. I never heard of the brand, but I was proud of my buy and took it back to the gun and passed them around. We took the wrapper off and found bugs in the chocolate. It had been a long wait, and the bugs were only on the outside, and when you banged the bar on the gun, the bugs fell off. The chocolate bars didn't last long, and I think we got most of the bugs off. If I ate any bugs, they tasted better than the chow that they had been feeding us. We had been in Espiritu Santo for over a week when we pulled up anchor and started back towards Guadalcanal. We had a new captain, Captain Cecil. Captain Hoover was transferred back to the Pentagon. We were glad for him, as he had been overseas since the war started, but we hated to see him go. We passed Guadalcanal and went on the right side of the Solomons and back to New Georgia. The Marines had landed, and we were going to bombard the Japanese strongholds on the north side of New Georgia. Kula Gulf lie between New Georgia and Kalamangara Island. It was the night of 23 January 1943, pitch black as usual. We had never been in this area before. We were running at 25 knots when I saw a blinking light ahead of us. It scared the hell out of us, but we hadn't heard the radar room report anything to the bridge. It turned out to be a U.S. submarine giving us directions. It was about midnight when we could see the outline of the islands. Then a blinking light from the side of one of the mountains appeared. An Australian coast watcher giving more directions. We turned into Kula Gulf. It was a horseshoe-shaped gulf with a narrow entrance. I knew I didn't like it when we went in. If the Japanese caught us in here, we would have to fight our way out, and it would be a tough battle with such a small entrance. We started to bombard when Japanese PT boats made a run at us. I couldn't see them, but the destroyer Strong was hit by a torpedo. It started to roll over, and another destroyer rammed her with his bow, trying to keep her upright. It didn't help. She rolled over and sank. Only a few sailors topside got off. We finished bombarding and got out of there fast. We were running at top speed, about 30 knots, when the radar room reported aircraft aft. It turned out to be just one aircraft who stayed out of gun range and dropped flares lighting up our convoy. When one went out, he would drop another. This went on all night. We were sure he was setting us up for submarines or aircraft. We stayed at general quarters all night expecting an attack at any moment. It never came. But he sure made it a long, scary night. We passed Guadalcanal the next day and headed back to Espiritu Santos. As we came back into Espiritu Santos, we noticed debris, life jackets, lifeboats on the beach. A transport with 1,000 soldiers aboard ran into one of our mines and sank in the harbor. Everyone got off, otherwise everything was the same. It had gotten to be a busy port. The CBs had built an airport, and B-24s and B-17s were flying out of Espiritu Santos against the Japanese in the Solomons. We did the usual, load ammunition supplies and watch old movies in the hangar at night. They put the screen in the center of the hangar. We watched from both sides. I always sit on the back side and learn to read backwards. I think there was only about 12 movies around Espiritu Santos. We saw each one several times, but always went back every chance we had. We did have a little excitement one night. We had a Japanese bomber that visited Espiritu Santos about once a week. We never paid much attention to him and never shot at him. The tower at the air base always talked to him and told him to go drop his bombs in the jungle, which he would do. This night he dropped them in the harbor. Bombs started hitting all around us. No one was hit, but we got a scare. We talked about next time we would be ready and shoot back. We were never there when he came back again. February and March 1943 were quiet. We were at sea most of the time, patrolling north of Guadalcanal, but saw no action. It was the first part of April when we got a report that over 100 Japanese aircraft had been spotted in the area. All anti-aircraft divisions went to general quarters. We stayed at general quarters for 3 days and only left the gun to go to the head. They even fed us on the gun, mutton sandwiches 3 meals a day. We stayed in the area thinking with that number of aircraft the Japanese may be sending ships to attack New Georgia. We stayed in rain showers as much as we could. One day a U.S. Navy bomber came out of a cloud and flew towards the task force. We watched it close, but to see it was U.S. Navy. Why he was there I never knew. Someone on one of the destroyers didn't recognize the plane and shot it down. It was a sad sight. The Japanese planes never found us. A few days later, the U.S. aircraft carriers arrived and gave us air cover. They would fly over us almost daily. It was nice to have them as company. They would practice diving and making torpedo runs on us, but this time no one fired at them. One day a torpedo bomber was diving straight down at us as we watched. He kept coming and it looked as he was going to crash right into us. We all yelled pull up like he could hear us. He waited too long. When he tried to pull out of the dive, a wing came off and he crashed into the sea about 200 yards off our port side. The 3 sailors aboard the aircraft all died. It was the 25th of April 1943 and I was 20 years old. I felt like I had aged more than 1 year. We never thought much about birthdays, only living another day. We went back to Espiritu Santos but only stayed a short time. May the 13th we headed back to Shell, New Georgia and Kalamangara Islands. It was midnight as usual when we entered Kulagup. Our target was Japanese anti-aircraft guns that had been giving the Air Force a bad time. We had a PBY flying over the anti-aircraft guns right before we started to fire. The Japanese turned the searchlights on him and we started shooting them out. We used tracers that night and you could see the shells as they went through the night sky. It looked like a bridge with lights on it. Then I saw shells exploding in the water on our port side. I said, "Hey, they're shooting at us." It sounded like I thought they weren't supposed to. They kept getting closer and closer. About 2 more moves, and the next round would hit us. They were coming straight at me, and I knew they would hit the ship near us. Then they stopped and went back the other way. I know God had to be watching out for me. I talked to one of my friends on a 20 millimeter on the main deck right below us, and he said the last shell exploded so close to the ship that it splashed water on them. When we started shelling, I counted 12 searchlights, and only one was burning when we left. The rest of May and the first part of June was quiet. I took a test for third-class gunner's mate on 1 May and again on 1 June. I made a 3.8 out of a possible 4.0 and couldn't understand why I didn't get promoted. I talked to the gunnery officer, and he said there was a mix-up and to take the exam again on 1 July and I would get promoted, no matter what score I made. It would be only a month delay, so I didn't mind. We went back to Espiritu Santos for more ammunition when a report came in that the Japanese fleet had been sighted near New Guinea. We left Espiritu Santos with the St. Louis Helena and 3 destroyers headed for New Guinea. We had never been in that area before. We spent 2 weeks around New Guinea and never sighted the Japanese fleet. I guess the Navy was sorry they couldn't find them, but I wasn't. We headed back the night of 3 July and was near Rendova Island, north of Guadalcanal, when the radar room reported 12 ships on our port bow. We went to general quarters and waited. These ships were headed north from the direction of Guadalcanal, so it would have been unlikely that the Japanese would be coming from that direction. No one was sure who they were. A destroyer was sent in close to have a look. It turned out to be transports headed for New Georgia. Even then, it was a scary few minutes. We couldn't let the 4th of July go by without fireworks, so we headed back to Culago. We escorted some transports and landed troops in Shell, New Georgia, the night of the 4th of July. Then we headed back to Espiritu Santos. Everyone was relaxed, and we were passing Guadalcanal when we saw signal lights flashing between ships. It was early afternoon, and we looked all around and could not see a cause for all the excitement. Then we saw the signal flags go up. We learned to read some of them. Change course to 000. Hey, that's back where we came from. Then the announcement came. The Japanese fleet had been sighted by an Australian coast watcher, and they were headed for Culago. We all knew what that meant. Another night sea battle. We knew there was Japanese cruisers, destroyers, and transports, but were not sure how many. I was sure we would be outnumbered. We had 3 cruisers and 3 destroyers. There was one other destroyer nearby, and he joined us. I was already nervous, and we were not even out of the Guadalcanal area yet. It would be close to 2 a.m. before we could get to Culago. I knew it was going to be another one of those long black nights. My nerves were shot. I wondered if I could go through another battle. This would be our 3rd night sea battle and 13th time we had engaged the enemy. I never thought about it being the 13th engagement or even getting killed or wounded. I was worried about being able to keep control of my mind. I had heard of sailors having nervous breakdowns, and that scared me more than anything. There wasn't anything I could do but go along for the ride. We sat and talked. We looked at our pictures of our wives and loved ones. Then it started to get dark. We had passed Salvo Island and were to the right of the Russell Islands, about 4 or 5 hours to Culago. Now all we could do was sit and stare into the dark. It was about 12, and I was talking to Gregory when I started shaking. I don't know why, as nothing happened. I was shaking so bad I had to sit down on the deck. Gregory sat down beside me and put his hand on my shoulder and talked to me. I got over it in a few minutes and was okay. It was after 1 a.m. and we could now see the outline of the mountains of New Georgia and Kalamangara. We were only minutes away from Kula Gulf. We were near the entrance when the report went to the bridge. Enemy ships sighted in Kula Gulf. They would have to try to get out the narrow opening which we now had blocked. They would have to come out in a single line, and we would cross the T. This meant they could only fire their forward guns, and we could fire all of ours. You cannot get into any better position than this in a sea battle. We looked but couldn't see anything. We watched the 6-inch mounts below us elevate the barrels. This meant we were going to fire at a longer range than any other sea battle. At 1:58 a.m. we opened fire. I was okay now. It was the waiting I couldn't take. Captain Cecil had all guns on rapid fire and full speed ahead, not like Captain Hoover, who changed the firing pattern and speed. As we moved forward, the 6-inch guns moved aft. They were firing right in front of our gun and knocked us all around, and burning cork was blowing into our ammunition room. Then he yelled to me that he had a fire in the ammunition room. I went to help him, and we got it out, but more would blow in. We decided to close the hatch. It was a big iron door, and each time we got it closed, they would fire again, and the hatch would knock both of us to the deck. We were leaning against the hatch when there was a loud explosion forward. The ship leaped in the air. I thought we hit a reef. Then we went down. I was 30 feet above the water line, and the water came into our gun shield. I thought, oh no, just like the Juno, we're going down. We made about 3 more bounces, then dead stop. It was dead quiet. The guns were quiet, and I was glad, as I had about all the hatch I could take. I asked Gregory what had happened, as he had the phones to the bridge. He said, I don't know. The phones were blown off my head, and I can't find them. Then another explosion aft. A few seconds passed, and another explosion aft. We still were not sure what had happened forward, but were sure that we had taken 2 torpedoes aft. We leaned over our gun shield and asked a sailor on the main deck what was going on. Abandon ship was the answer. I said, let's go. But Gregory said, wait a minute, I can't find my life jacket. I gave him mine, as I had 2, one to wear and one I used as a pillow. Our life raft was on number 1 turret forward. It was pitch black, but we worked our way forward. When we got to number 2 turret, we found out what happened forward. The bow was gone from number 2 turret forward. Denny, Gregory, and I worked our way aft when we saw sailors going over the side using a rope tied to the railing. It looked good, so we waited our turn and went over the side. It didn't turn out to be as good as it looked in the dark. It was only about 4 foot long, and you dropped the rest of the way, landing on someone. Before you could get out of the way, you were hit in the head by someone else. We found a life raft a few yards away, but it was upside down and the paddles were underneath. I went under the raft and cut the paddles loose. We paddled but went nowhere. I told Gregory, let's swim. He said, I don't know how. I said, hang on to my life jacket. We're going. We went about 50 yards when we found another raft. It was full, but there was room to hang on to the side. We looked back, and you could see the bow was gone, and it was broken amidship. It looked like a big V, and we could see the smokestacks being crushed as it went under. I hung onto the raft with both hands, as I had heard about ships pulling you under when they sank. It was gone, and I never felt anything. We were hit at 2:13 a.m. and sank at 2:35 a.m. The ship was gone, and it was quiet. The water was covered with diesel, but it never caught fire. We had 3 rafts together now, but still no room inside. It appeared as if all the other ships had left, and that we were the only ones hit. Then a Japanese ship started firing, shells going over our heads, some landing close by. What were they shooting at? Then we saw it. The bow was still afloat. Hours passed and nothing happened. We were still in the diesel. The water was very salty and the diesel was burning my eye. I thought how good it would be to have a clean white handkerchief to wipe my eye. I started to get cold even though the water was warm. There was more shooting, but we had no idea who was fighting. It must have been about 4 a.m. when we saw a destroyer moving slowly about 100 yards from us. We didn't know if it was Japanese or U.S. The captain was on one of the two rafts that had joined up with us. He talked about what we should do. They decided to signal the ship with a light. I decided to put a little distance between me and the raft in case it was Japanese. I decided not to be taken prisoner. I swam off but stayed close enough to keep the raft in sight. I heard them shout when they found out it was ours, so I swam back to the raft. The captain told everyone to wait by the raft and we would have a better chance of getting picked up. A sailor hanging on to the raft next to me and I talked about swimming over to the destroyer and making sure they saw us, as they weren't getting any closer. I said okay, and we started swimming towards the destroyer. We were almost close enough to call to them when they took off. They were still fighting off Japanese attacks and trying to pick up Helena survivors. It was a long swim back, and we had a hard time finding the rafts. When I reached the raft, I was exhausted. A sailor that was sitting on the raft reached over and held me up by my life jacket. He must have held me for over 30 minutes. Without his help, I'm not sure if I would have made it. I never knew who I swam with or who held me up, but I always wished I did. It must have been about 6:30 when we saw the destroyer coming our way again. He slowed down and started picking up survivors. It was light now, and we knew it was ours. I didn't wait. I started swimming with all the strength I had left. As I got near, I heard a sailor yell, "You better hurry, as we're going to have to leave. Japanese planes are coming in fast." When I reached the side of the ship, it was moving. There was a net hanging over the side, and I grabbed it. It was all I could do to pull myself out of the water. As I reached the railing on the main deck, the 5-inch guns were firing right over my head. I fell over the railing and rolled under the gun mount to get away from the muzzle blast. The aircraft were gone in a few minutes, and the guns were silent. We were doing 40 knots headed south. I got up and worked aft to the fantail. The screws were vibrating the deck under my feet. It was so good to be out of the water. I thanked God that I was alive, but I couldn't help but feel for the ones we left in the water. I knew Gregory was still back there as he couldn't swim. I think I was one of the first to start swimming, so I knew I left most of them on the raft behind. I don't know how long I was standing there when a sailor handed me some dry clothes and said I was on the USS Nicholas. They were now doing for us what we had done for the sailors off the carrier Wasp. I showered and got most of the diesel off. I ran into Brooks in the shower room and was glad to see he made it. I put on the dry clothes and ate breakfast and slept all the way to Tulagi. In Tulagi we were transferred to the Honolulu, and that afternoon we headed for Espiritu Santos. That night I tried to sleep on the deck, but I was so bruised and sore from where the hatch hit me I couldn't sleep. I went to the sick bay for a pain pill. They made me stay there all night. I don't know if it was the pain pill or the bed. I never moved until late the next morning. I hadn't slept in a bed in over a year. They wanted me to stay, but I didn't like it below deck. I had a tough time the next night sleeping on the deck, but it was better than being below deck. When we reached Espiritu Santos, we were transferred ashore. The next day we got to send a cablegram to our family telling them we were okay. Since the bow with the number 50 of the Helena did not sink, the Japanese knew which ship they sank. They reported it the next day, and it was reported by U.S. newspapers. Marie told me later that on her way to work she heard a cruiser was sunk. She said something told her it was the Helena, and she cried and worried all morning. Then at noon my brother found out it was the Helena and called her. It was 9 days before she received my cablegram telling her I was okay. We were on Espiritu Santos for about 3 days when they announced that all third-class seamen and above would go back to the States for reassignment, and seamen first and below would stay overseas and be reassigned to a new ship. I was supposed to make third class on 1 July, but all the records were aboard ship and I couldn't locate the gunnery officer that knew I was to be promoted. I didn't care about the rank. I wanted to go home. We were so upset we talked about going AWOL, but where could you go on Espiritu Santos? A few days later we were put aboard a transport and taken to New Caledonia to a rest camp. We rested all right because there was nothing there but tents and 2 baseball diamonds. About the third night there, I woke up about 3 a.m. with asthma. I hadn't had asthma in 3 years. I was awake almost every night until we got back to Noumea. There was still a lot of talk about what a raw deal we had gotten when we heard we were going back to the States. An officer off the Helena was still in charge of our group, and he had been fighting to get us back to the States. We heard he threatened to promote us all to third class if they didn't let us go back to the States. I never knew if it was true, but we were going home on the first transport that had room for us. I was working in a warehouse waiting for a ship when I had a bad asthma attack. I couldn't work. They told me I would have to work or go on sick call. I know they would put me in the hospital and I might miss the ship home. I tried to work, but I couldn't. I went to the hospital and was there 4 days when Gregory came and told me they were leaving. I went to see the doctor and asked if I could go with them. He said okay if I would go to the hospital when I got to the States. We left the next day for San Diego. It would take 2 weeks to get to San Diego. I did okay for a few days, and I got sick again, back in the sick bay, which was below decks. I didn't like it, but they would not give me any medication if I didn't stay there. I was asleep when I heard a loud crash. I didn't know what happened, but I was topside in seconds. It knocked me out of my bunk, and I hit the deck running. We were rammed by another transport going the other way. It made a large dent in the side of the ship near where I was sleeping. I never went back to the sick bay. I slept on the deck until we reached San Diego. We arrived in San Diego Destroyer Base about noon, and the captain of the base said he would pay us, get us a uniform, and have us downtown San Diego by 5 p.m. No one said anything about me reporting to the hospital, so I didn't. They told us we were going to get a 30-day leave, and I wanted to go home. We got to town all right, but we all looked like recruits from boot camp in our new blue uniform. We decided what we needed was campaign ribbons. We went to the Navy store, but no one knew what ribbons we had coming. Then someone said, "Who cares? Buy the ones with the most colors." We each bought at least 2. It was good enough for the first night. Then someone decided Old Salt should wear earrings. I decided that ribbons was all I wanted, but Hiles, a friend of mine, bought a set of earrings and wanted me to wear the other one. I said no thank you. The next day 4 of my friends cornered me and said they thought I should wear an earring. I said no. Then they grabbed me and took my name tag, which was pinned to my shirt, and pinned it to my ear. It was then that I accepted the earring, and they took my name tag out of my ear and put the earring in. We were given 30 days leave, and I headed for San Antonio. I couldn't get tickets out of San Diego, but I could out of Los Angeles. I hitchhiked to Los Angeles and was in San Antonio in 3 days. When we pulled into the station, I saw Marie standing on the platform waiting for me. She was more beautiful than I remembered. I ran from the train and held her in my arms and hugged and kissed her. It was wonderful to be home. We had to be in Norfolk, Virginia in 30 days, as I was assigned to the USS Houston. Marie went with me to Norfolk, and we got to spend a lot of time together as the Houston was being built and was still in the shipyard. We visited Emmett in Washington, D.C., and the 3 of us went to New York City. Then I started getting sick again. It went on about a week, and I had to go back to the hospital. I was in the hospital about a week when they told me that they were going to give me a medical discharge. I was in the hospital and didn't get to see very much. I was not sure when I would get out of the Navy, but Marie and I decided it was better for her to go back home. It was almost Christmas and she would be home, and I hoped I would be there by then. I was discharged on 31 December 1943. In August 1989, Marie and I attended the 46th reunion of the USS Helena in Helena, Montana. We participated in the presentation of the memorial to the 4 USS Helenas. The first Helena was a gunboat, the second a light cruiser, the one I was on, the third a heavy cruiser, and the present a nuclear sub. No one from my gun was there. I only met one sailor that I remembered, but we had a wonderful time and made a lot of new friends, some that was on the same life raft that I was on. Our next reunion is in 1991 in Nashville, Tennessee, which we are looking forward to attending. Maria and I celebrated our 48th wedding anniversary on 9 May 1990. Aboard ship, we used to talk about telling our war stories to our wife, our children, and our grandchildren. God has blessed me with all three, and I hope each one of you enjoy the story as much as I have telling it to you.